You're listening to Refracted World with Terry Geo, Episode 17, How the Egyptians Really Built the Pyramids. I'm sure many of us have seen pictures, videos, or even have been fortunate enough to stand in front of the pyramids and look at them and say, wow. But also, how? Each block that makes up the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau weighs a massive 2.5 tons. And there are 2.3 million of these slabs of granite stone. The pyramid stands at 138 metres, but that would have been even more with the original limestone casing over it. And the tools they used to mine and build this precise monument were simple sticks with stones attached. The pyramid was completed 4,600 years ago. We barely have the knowledge or technology today to replicate this impressive structure. So how did the ancient Egyptians? Well, I can reveal to you today, they had help. If you turn on the History Channel, you may see a documentary talking about how aliens came down to Earth and built the pyramids for us. And this is a huge injustice to our species, our integrity, and human learning. Because the answer to how the Egyptian pyramids were built really is a simple one. They were built by Egyptians, using hundreds of years of passed down knowledge. And you don't have to take my word for it. The evidence still exists today and can be seen all over Egypt in the ancient ruins which still litter the landscape. But how could they have built such precise, impressive structures with such rudimentary, primitive tools? Give me 20 minutes or so of your time and I'll explain. Pharaohs, the kings and sometimes queens of Egypt, had a god complex, as in they actually believed they were directly working for them, or in some cases were the human embodiment of the gods themselves. It wasn't always like this, but being both leader of the state and the country's religion, I guess power eventually went to their heads. Around 3100 BCE, the pharaohs decreed they represented the gods, and were depicted as so in temple hieroglyphics. I'm simplifying and condensing a lot of history here, but pharaohs believed that death was merely a stepping stone to the next life. They would meet Anubis, the god of death, and their heart would literally be weighed. The more benevolent the pharaoh had been in life, the lighter the heart. It would be placed on a scale and weighed against a feather. If it was lighter than the feather, they would be accepted into the kingdom of the gods. As if this wasn't a daunting enough task, they also had to follow a series of practices and rituals to get their meeting with Anubis in the first place. One couldn't just die and arrive at the gates of the afterlife. We know from the Book of the Dead the extensive work that went into preparing the body for its continuing journey. The mummification process could take weeks, with some organs removed and saved in canopic jars, and others, like the brain, whisked up and discarded. The brain was not favoured with the ancient Egyptians. The heart was the only organ to stay inside the body, as they believed this was to be the most important. As an aside, millennia later, we now realise that the brain is not only the most important organ, it is basically us, as it houses our consciousness. Everything else, including the heart, merely operates as a power plant to keep our brain alive. But back then, they thought the thing that pumps our blood around was the most important, so it stayed within the mummified corpse. After the lengthy and often brilliant work by the priests, the pharaohs were laid to rest in their tomb. In the early days, these took the form of mastabas. Mastabas are mud bricks stacked up in a rectangular building with sloping sides and a flat roof. But as the centuries went by, the later pharaohs wanted more. Mud bricks may have been fine in the desert air, but mud bricks were not fine for the later pharaohs. Hundreds of years after the beginning of mastabas, they were no longer grand enough for our godlike pharaohs. They needed bigger and better structures to outdo their predecessors and present themselves to their people as the greatest ruler of all time. And that's when we arrive in 2670 BCE and the first pyramid ever built for Pharaoh Zoser, the Step Pyramid. It is an impressive feat of engineering, which was dreamed up by the pharaoh's vizier, Imhotep, a name many of us may recognise from the film The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. But unlike the undead monster, the real Imhotep was the ancient Egyptians' version of Albert Einstein. He was a genius, creating the largest, now stone, mastaba ever built. But that wasn't enough for Zoser. He wanted more. Here's how I imagine the conversation went between Zoser and Imhotep. "My king, I have built you the largest mastaba in all of Egypt." Make it bigger." "My king, I have placed a second mastaba on top of the first." Wonderful. Add another." "Yes, sire." "My men have created a third mastaba on top of the first two. It is now a monument worthy of the gods themselves." Is it though? I think the gods would like it bigger." "Yes, sire. We have built an additional 3 mastabas on top, making this a 6-step monument for the funeral complex. Does this please you, my king?" As I'm old now and I don't have much time left, I suppose it will have to do." And dies. And that's how the step pyramid came to be. And you can't tell me otherwise because you can't prove it. Before this point of time, there was no word for pyramid because it hadn't existed yet. Imhotep made that a reality. And when it was made, it was so well made that it's still standing proudly today at an impressive 62.5 meters high. For many, many generations, the population of Egypt will have been used to seeing and even help build mastabas for their kings, starting with bricks of mud and then extending those bricks into a line and then stacking those bricks on top of each other, sloping them, making a roof, making a mastaba. And from the mud, it then went to stone, and there would have been a skilled workforce of labourers who specialised in quarrying the stone, shaping the slabs, and building the mud or stone monuments. And from that well-established technique, we progress to Imhotep's pyramid, a stone structure of 6 mastabas stacked high. I could also talk about the incredible work of the entire funeral complex, which is huge by the way, and the pharaoh's tomb built inside the pyramid, which is such incredible work. But that would take a whole episode of its own, and all the information is online if you want to have a look at it. Anyway, back to Zoser. This one act by Zoser and Imhotep was to change the course, and actually the landscape of Egypt, from the Old Kingdom and beyond. Once one pharaoh had a pyramid, all pharaohs wanted a pyramid. Needed a pyramid. In total, the Egyptians built a mind-boggling 118 pyramids over the coming centuries, and each time they gained more knowledge of how to build them bigger and better than the last. Or at least that was the idea. Of course, stacking mastabas is one thing, but for a true pyramid, it needs to have beautifully smooth angled sides. So if we fast forward another 100 years, we come to the reign of Sneferu, who wanted just that. No common steps for him. There is debate whether or not he was pharaoh for the construction of the Maiden Pyramid first, but that's not important for this story, as even if it can be a tribute to him, that was not a true pyramid. It was kind of half a pyramid with a mastaba on top. Sneferu wanted a true pyramid, and so his immense workforce went out to a new spot just south of modern-day Cairo and began building. Now, as I mentioned before, building pyramids takes a long time, decades long in some cases. But with over 100 years of knowledge, they believed they could do it. And of course it had to be completed within the pharaoh's lifetime. Not only did the pharaoh want to see it, they also had to be laid to rest there, and you can't be laid to rest in a half-built pyramid. So the builders marked out their initial square on the ground with posts and ropes, and built up the slabs of stone. Unfortunately, the angle of the pyramid was far too steep, and halfway up started to show signs of instability. So they changed the angle from 54 degrees to 43 degrees and completed what we now know as the bent pyramid. But of course, old Sneffy couldn't have his eternal slumber in a defective monument, so on the adjacent plateau he also built the Red Pyramid, which is not only the third largest pyramid ever built, it is also the first ever true pyramid. Finally fit for a king. Although his final resting place has still not been found, and there is speculation that a hidden burial chamber does exist and is hidden somewhere within the Red Pyramid. Or it could be that he got so sick of seeing pyramids, he checked himself into an Airbnb and was never seen of again. Anyway, all of this historical evidence leads us to the Giza Plateau, and the two most famous of all the pyramids in the entire world, those of Khufu and his son Khafre. Khufu took to the throne after Sneferu had passed, and seeing what his predecessor had done, obviously he had to do better. In a very big way. He built the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing today. Of the 7 wonders, not of pyramids, obviously. As another aside, it's actually speculated that one of the 7 wonders never even existed, but I will talk about that in a future episode. When Khufu died, his first son Djedefre became pharaoh for about 10 years. Very little is known about him, his life, or his death. We do know he built a now ruined pyramid in Abu Rara, and is sometimes accredited with the building of the Sphinx, but that honour is more widely given to the next ruler of Egypt, another of Khufu's sons, Khafre. In his time on the throne, he built the Giza Plateau and placed his own monument next to his father's, a monumentally massive monument. From the front looking on, it does appear as Khafre's pyramid is larger than his father's, the Great Pyramid. But this was just very clever design. Khafre built on higher ground to give the illusion of size, although saying that, it's still humongous, at an original height of 136 metres, making it the second largest pyramid ever built. The funeral complex of the Giza Plateau is as impressive as it is magnificent, and with the Nile on its doorstep, at least back then, it was relatively easy for the 30,000 strong workforce to bring slabs of stone directly from the quarry to the site via boats. And we know it was 30,000 strong as the workers' camp has been excavated next to the Giza Plateau. And unlike the days when people said slaves had to have built the pyramids, there is archaeological evidence of good food, medicine, and good living quarters. Historians now believe that these workers were paid and treated well to do the grueling work of building these monuments to their kings and their gods. More pyramids were built in the many centuries after Khafre, but none ever reached the same dizzying heights. And 1,200 years after Imhotep stacked some mastabas to appease his ever-demanding pharaoh, the last pyramid was built. Ahmose I reigned in 1525 BCE, but his monument was not meant to be a tomb. There is no burial chamber, and in fact, the act of pyramid building was so out of fashion, or more probably out of favour with the population because it cost so much and broke people's backs, that Ahmose's pyramid was made out of rubble and sand, with only its limestone exterior holding its shape. It once stood at just 40 metres, but unsurprisingly, it is now just a pile of rubble in the sand. And with that, the great period of pyramid building came to a pretty sad end, actually. Soon after, the Greeks invaded Egypt, and Alexander the Great was crowned King of Egypt. And so began the integration of Western and Egyptian cultures. Instead of pyramids, Alexander founded the great port city, which still bears his name. There he built another of the 7 wonders, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. But more impressive, in my eyes, was the library. This was the largest stock of knowledge in the entire world. It is said that everyone who sailed into the port would add to the collection. Thousands of shelves stuffed full with scrolls from every corner of the globe in one place. Pyramids may have stopped being built, but the how-to volumes will all have been there alongside histories from all ancient civilizations, with novels and poems, papers, global charts, star charts, scientific doctrine. When Alexander the Great died, his crown was passed on through the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy had been a general and bodyguard to Alexander, and in 305 BCE he declared himself pharaoh, and his family line continued to rule for 275 years, all the way up to the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra. Now the Romans were the prevailing empire of the world, and their invasion spelled the end of Egyptian life, as it had been for thousands of years. The library had grown considerably in this time frame. People from all over the world journeyed to Alexandria to read and to study the approximately 100,000 scrolls and books. But in 48 CE, Julius Caesar set fire to the Ptolemies' ships in the port of Alexandria. The fire grew and spread to the library, which was burned to the ground, taking with it centuries, if not millennia, of information and knowledge. As a final aside for this episode, the lighthouse survived the siege of Alexandria and stood for many more years. But after a series of earthquakes, it was an abandoned ruin by 1323 CE, and in 1480, the surviving stones were taken away for other building projects. It was written about over the years, but it wasn't until the 1990s when we discovered the remains under the sea in the port. But back to the history. With the library gone, so too was the pyramid building knowledge, or at least so we believe. We don't actually know the majority of what was in the library, but if you were going to keep your documents anywhere, you would keep them there, especially as it was in Egypt. And so I believe, and many others believe, that the last of the knowledge of the pyramid building was gone up in flames. But through many years of archaeology, excavations, and translations of hieroglyphs, thank you, Rosetta, and if you don't know about that, I'll talk about that in a different episode as well, we have a pretty good understanding of how the pyramids were built, who built them, and why. And now, so do you. Time as a scale is incredibly difficult for us humans to really understand as we live such short lives. The first pyramid was built almost 5,000 years ago, but the ancient Egyptian civilization began even earlier than that. When burying their leaders, they began with modest tombs, moving to mastabas, and hundreds of years later, accidentally invented a pyramid. Time. The more you have, the more you can achieve. And the Egyptian Empire had a lot of time, more time than we've had, to perfect their craft. And there is a really simple way for us to understand all of this. I grew up in the 1980s. Back then, we only had 4 TV channels. We had tape cassettes, and we had a plugged-in landline phone. Fast forward just 20 years, and we have the internet, laptop computers, mobile phones with cameras and video cameras, and devices that act like computers in our pockets, hundreds of TV channels, and the ability to communicate, even visually, with anyone else in the world instantaneously. All of these things were science fiction to me as a kid, and yet we learn, we invent, and we progress at a fast pace, just like all civilizations have, using the tools and means of our time. We should never discredit how ingenious our species can be when we focus our collective minds on a task. And now you know that aliens did not build the pyramids, and if you ever speak to anybody who says, yes, they did, please direct them to this podcast, because in 20 minutes, I can disprove that, and they can learn the truth. This also is even more proof that aliens still haven't visited Earth, if aliens even exist at all. But that's the Fermi paradox, and that will indeed need to be a future episode. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and maybe even learned something along the way. As I said at the start, I have missed out a lot of information to compact this episode into a digestible chunk. I've just encapsulated 6,000 years of history into 20 minutes, but hopefully it was just enough to be understandable. I like doing this. I like being able to take big issues or lots of history and compact it in a way that is understandable to everybody, and I hope it was. I did use the wonderful resources online for exact dates and times and names, but the majority came from my very geeky brain. I love talking about history and would love to do more episodes like this if you like them. So please let me know in the comments after this episode or on social media if you want more geeky history stuff, then yes, I would love to give it to you. And that's the end of this week's show. But the episode is continued, sort of, in my first ever subscriber-only episode entitled Why Conspiracy Theories Make Sense. There are two ways to listen to it, either by signing up to my Patreon, RefractedWorld, or subscribing to RefractedWorld on Spotify. The first tier is only £3, I'm guessing $5, I'm not sure. Or, if you're just looking for merch, then you can find all the Refracted World merch you could ever want on my Etsy store, which is called Fun Created. I'll put all of this information in the bio, just in case you want to check any of it out. But don't worry, if you don't want to spend any money at all, that's fine. I will still be here next week, as always, bringing you a brand new episode for free. And I hope you join me too. Until then, goodbye and take care.